And it wasn't the prettiest game, certainly on the Giants side of things, but it was decently close in the scoreboard to where you couldn't really turn it off at any point in time. You really had to pay attention all the way to the near very end. And I think I want to start with Russell Wilson, right? The Steelers get the win here 26-18, and a big reason why, in my opinion, is because of how good Russell Wilson is playing right now. He got his first start last week when Mike Tomlin made the, somewhat hostile decision to move on from Justin Fields and put Russell Wilson out there despite the fact that the Steelers were 4-2 on the season and they were winning. And Ollie, when I watched Russ last week, even what I saw last week, I said, okay, I get it. Russ feels confident. He looks confident. Now, it wasn't quite what it looked like this week, but you could tell those touch passes, those layered passes, that confidence throwing the ball to the sideline, those back shoulders, and especially the deep throws when it came to putting touch on those passes. Russ was doing that better than Justin Fields was, even with Fields playing well, given his skill set. And so I watched the tape last week, and I was really encouraged by Russell Wilson, and I was once again encouraged by what we saw last night. Russ goes 20 for 28 in this game, 278 yards, 1 touchdown, but he had a couple of touchdowns thrown back as well. Those opportunities where, man, if those were touchdowns instead of the field goals that they got, maybe this game was more of a blowout than it ended up being in the final scoreboard. But what'd you think of Russell Wilson overall? I'd love to hear your thoughts here because there's been so much talk about Russ, like, right, when he was still with Seattle and him kind of wanting his way out and him and Pete Carroll butting heads, and then he does get out. It's this crazy, massive trade going to the Denver Broncos, and it absolutely falls flat on its face for the 2 years that he was there. It's a 1-year flyer on basically a vet minimum for him to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers, but to be honest with you, he looks more worth the big contract here in Pittsburgh now without it than he did in the final year that he was in Seattle and even his time in Denver. So what'd you see from Russ? What'd you like? And maybe what can improve?
Yeah, really impressive. I thought you nailed it. He kind of, I think, fits more where they want to be, particularly with Arthur Smith as the offensive coordinator. It's just way more wide zone than boot football, right? And I think you hit on it perfectly where we kind of got old school Russ back, where it's heavy play action, heavy personnel groupings, hitting shot plays outside the numbers. I mean, his numbers through 2 weeks on pass attempts over 25 yards outside the numbers are vintage Russ. That was always the thing with Russell Wilson, is he could hit low percentage throws at such an outrageous clip that you could take and live with the fact that you're just voiding the middle of the field for large parts of games. And then when he goes to Denver, for whatever happened there, he decides it's the late stage of his career, he just wants to become Drew Brees. I'm going to Drew Brees us down the field. I'm going to play point guard from the shotgun. And it's just not who he is, not who he's ever been, not where he's been effective. And so it's fun to kind of see him roll back to that Seattle style, where, as you mentioned, he's driving the ball down the field outside, and we see them incrementally shift the offense, where you go from, in terms of mobility, movement, threat within the offense, it goes from playing in the gun with Justin Fields, who is a better downhill thumping threat, right? And you can do more in the option game with that. Mm-hmm. And with Russ, it just becomes way more boot oriented. And you can see pretty dramatically in their numbers from last week, and then it jumped out even more last night, trading out kind of from the gun quick game passes to more boot oriented. They were up to 16% running boots last night, and that doesn't include all the wide zone stuff. And they've actually slimmed down the run game. Now they've got Russ, and it's like, let's just run this really small collection of run plays and maximize it. We got issues along the offensive line at center and guard, and we're rolling guys through there because of injury. So let's just simplify things, get a hat in a hat. Let's go let our backs make some plays, and then Russ can take shots down the field. So to me, look, there's going to be way more difficult tests ahead, I think, than they faced the last 2 weeks. But that is the idealized version of who you want Russell Wilson to be at any stage of his career, particularly at this point of his career. And I'm just pretty impressed that the arm still looks so alive, because that was a concern I had towards the end in Denver, and it just looks absolutely fine throwing the ball down the field.
No, it does. Over the last 2 weeks, we've seen the vintage Russell Wilson moon ball, as they call it, where he's just putting all the air in the world under those passes. And, you know, it feels like George Pickens is the perfect wide receiver for him in that style, winning at the sideline, winning in contested catch situations. I mean, a couple of those passes were just beauties last night. And George Pickens got some of the best hands in the NFL, some of the strongest hands in the NFL. And we saw a couple of instances where that was the case last night. I'm glad that you kind of brought up, again, what he was able to do when he was getting on the run, because, Russ, he's a shorter quarterback, right? It's more difficult to throw over the middle of the field. People talk about that all the time, and it felt like he was kind of forcing that a little bit, maybe in his final year in Seattle during his time with the Denver Broncos. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but again, it's just you saying that he wanted to be Drew Brees. That's sort of how it felt. It was like, oh, okay, like I'm going to Denver now. And even when Nathaniel Hackett was there, it's like he wanted to, just like you said, become this point guard. And that's not why you trade for a player like that. That's not why you pay the player that contract. You do that because you need them to be a takeover type of a player for you.
Yeah, it really felt like he kind of bought into this idea that to win an MVP, he had to transform the player he was, and he would maybe get more cultural cachet as a great quarterback by playing a different way, rather than just, I don't know, being on the MVP ballot routinely because you play the way you play, and very few people hit the deep shot as well as he hits it when he's playing at his best. So it's fun to see him kind of buy in and move back towards that style. And it's the perfect setup with what they're doing. As you mentioned, having Pickens, Darnell Washington being both an extra lineman, and then with Wilson, he's been really effective in the small sample size, but really effective as kind of that intermediate threat bailout guy for them when they run a bunch of the boot stuff. So it's just really fun to see him return back to the player that he was when I thought he was just at the apex of his powers. And other than that, there's not been a dramatic shift in what they're actually running as an offense. He's just been ever so slightly more efficient in everything they do, whilst adding in this more explosive element down the field. Fields was just not hitting throws outside the numbers down the field anywhere near the same rate Russell has. And even last night, he only attempted 2 passes over 10 yards in the middle of the field, and both were incompletions. And that tells you everything you need to know. Even when the opening couple of drives where they stall out in the red zone, right? It was a stall out in the red zone kind of game for both teams. Bad penalties, bad decision making. When they missed on that stuff, what do we see? It's Wilson in the gun playing point guard. And there was some communication issues and opportunities left on the field, and the Pickens touchdown that was overturned for an incomplete pass. But that was just, for me, a microcosm of Russell Wilson's where he's at in his career now, which is when he just is in the gun for 3 downs and he's got to pick his spot and read things out and try and play. He's just nowhere near as effective as when he's kind of a functional element within your offense where he can hand the ball off, be a backside threat to have people, commit to the wide zone, and then take shots where he's just still magical throwing the ball down the field.
Yeah, and I said this last week on the QB show with Seth Galina. It's not that Fields can't hit deep down the field, but I think it does look different because Fields is always throwing a fastball. Like, he is always, like, I think that's kind of Anthony Richardson's problem a little bit too, is it just always feels like it's a fastball with those two guys. And with Russ, there's so much more natural touch on his passes, and he can really, fit it into a breadbasket, if you will, just putting it right over the corner, right over the shoulder of the wide receiver. Those sort of touch passes that Russ even showed us last week. He showed us a few more of them this week, and he just looks very confident. I'd be remiss if I didn't also, talk about how them coming out and being able to run the football as well as they did, I think really set the tone and the confidence for this team, because I do believe that that's a thing. And the team was able to do what they really wanted to do, to move the ball deep down the field with their first drive and running the ball with Najee Harris, who he's stringing together a couple of really good games here. I think 4 out of the last 5 games, he's graded above 65, if not above 70, with his rushing grade. And so he's becoming a lot more effective. He's got a good yards after contact average. He's got a good forced missed tackles average as well. So Najee Harris playing really well, over 100 yards in this game. And it just felt like the Arthur Smith offense, it was at its best. It was at its ideal form last night when the Pittsburgh Steelers faced and took down the New York Giants. Let's talk about the Giants a little bit. I don't really know if there's anything on the offensive side necessarily that you want to hit. I thought Tyrone Tracy looked really good again. He is absolutely their best option out of the backfield. He is so electric, and I think he showcased that again. Malik Neighbors, obviously a good day for him, a good day for Darius Slayton as well, but also Malik had the couple of drops that were killer for this team that it's like, all right, well, I'm a believer that it's like, okay, I don't want to freak out over drops. Like, it's just going to happen as a wide receiver. But, like, man, a couple of those were killers. Like, come on. And I think you were watching Brian Daboll have the same thought process, after the big drop. I believe it was in the third quarter where Neighbors drops a slant that could have been a first down. The camera, of course, immediately goes to Daboll because they think he's going to explode after every play, but he doesn't. He kind of is just staring out there, and then when Neighbors gets to the sideline, he knows Neighbors pissed, and you can tell, like, he goes up to Neighbors and he says something to him, and he's basically just like, hey, we'll get him next time, whatever it is. But outside of that, the offensive side of things, I thought the offensive line struggled again for the Giants. It's hard not to, right? You and I just did defensive line rankings for the Pittsburgh for the NFL in general, and the Pittsburgh Steelers were number one in the NFL on both of our lists. So it's hard to not think that the struggling Giants offensive line without Andrew Thomas was going to struggle against Pittsburgh's defensive line. But I sort of want to talk about the Giants' defensive line more and how well they were still able to play. Azeez Ojulari now getting in the mix as a high-impact edge rusher for this team as well. But to me, if the Giants are going to win anything, it's going to come through that strength of their defensive line. But what do you think just overall of the Giants, who are, they're now sitting here at 2-6. I think the playoffs are, out of the question, and we're talking about what they could be in the future. This defensive line is a good building block for them moving forward.
Oh, for sure. I think just quickly on the offensive side, I don't think Daboll did his guys a ton of favors last night. And it's really difficult, right? Because you lose all the linemen they've lost. Left tackle is the best player in your team. He goes down, maybe Malik Neighbors. But to have 41 straight dropbacks from Daniel Jones, very little pocket movement, playing, as we said, the best defensive line in the NFL. I'm just not sure if that is like premium game planning. I mean, they ran the ball effectively. It was run the ball, then drop and take some shots. So I understand that as an approach, but to have so little movement, so little creativity, just being so forced into the screen game is just, to me, not the best way to maximize being this team. And they're also in this real bind, right? You mentioned Tyrone Tracy, who is so electric carrying the ball, creates so many yards after contact, so many yards at the second level. And then when he gets into pass pro, it's just completely lost, scanning all over the place, no idea what to do. And you get these killer back-breaking sacks, and it's so difficult. I don't want to come on here and poo-poo for the people who love watching electric plays. I love watching all the electric plays, but as a staff, you get in such a bind, right, where it's like, this guy is so effective for us with the ball in his hands, but it's really difficult for us to have solid pass pro if this guy doesn't know where he's supposed to be because he's a rookie and it's going to take him some time to learn. And we've mentioned this a bunch of times, right, that one of the big differentiating factors for offenses right now of what all these teams are doing along the defensive line is finding guys who can handle pass pro, or finding as a staff creative ways to limit what those guys have to actually handle in pass pro. And I'm not sure the Giants did a great job of maximizing either of those, but you mentioned the defensive line, and as it always is the case, right? Win with a four-man rush, you're going to win a bunch of games in the NFL. They're not winning a whole bunch right now, but it's undeniable that those guys can just take over and wreck games. And if not wreck the entire game, at least wreck a quarter to give you a chance to get back into the game. Lawrence was completely unblockable all night. And the Steelers ran some really wonky stuff that was just bizarre to leave him one-on-one a bunch. He was double plenty. The plan, I would think, would be to double him every single time it's plausible or possible. It's not like the Giants had a whole bunch of stuff to make it where it's difficult to double him. And at times they'd be doubling Nunez Rodgers. And it's like, you understand that's Dexter Lawrence, right? And every time you're not doubling him, he's in the backfield in every single play. So, and this is without Kayvon, of course, with the wrist injury at the moment. So that is an absolute building block, as you mentioned there, as they look forward to the end of this season, projecting into next season. That thing, at least, what they've invested in, they've got the rewards, right? The contracts, the trades, they are getting out of that what they've put into it.
Yeah, really quick, because you and I were talking about this a little bit before the show, and I think this is probably the part of the show where it makes the most sense to talk about it. With the Giants sitting here at 2-6, I think they're picking number 8 or number 9 overall if the draft were to be this weekend. We assume that the team's probably going to end up in the top 10. It's just sort of a matter of how high in the top 10 are the Giants going to pick. With that being the case, trade deadline is coming up. We talked about the defensive line. You talk about Dexter Lawrence. They don't have Kayvon Thibodeau. Azeez Ojulari definitely showed up for this team last night, and he's had a couple of games this year where Ojulari has really stood out. Is he somebody that you'd consider here maybe as a trade candidate? We talked before the show about maybe Evan Neal. Evan Neal only played one snap last night. It was the first snap that he had played all season. Do you look to move Evan Neal, even though the offensive line is not perfect, still struggling in and of itself? To me, it's basically, all right, are you going to play Evan Neal, or can you move on from him and try to get something for this first-round pick if you don't have him in your long-term future? But thoughts about the trade block for the Giants? Because it doesn't Dexter Lawrence, it's off the table. Like, we're not going to trade Dexter Lawrence. Obviously, you just traded for Brian Burns, so you're not going to trade him. I think Ojulari and Evan Neal feel like the two top candidates if the Giants are going to be sellers at the deadline, that they would actually be the players that you move. Do you agree, or do you see anybody else?
Yeah, I think so. My thought process would be we just need as many assets as possible to be able to make a decision at quarterback in the offseason, right? If we want to move up, what assets can we get? And Neal would bring back, what, 7th, 6th, maybe. Ojulari, maybe mid-round because he's a free agent at the end of the year. The one I would certainly call around a dangle is I think with Ojulari's progression, you could call about Kayvon Thibodeau. Now, maybe that's one you could just do in the offseason if you wanted to. But if everyone else is striking out of trying to find edge guys, if you call the Lions and say, could you give us a 3 that becomes a 2? Could you give us a 2 that becomes a 1 if you win the whole thing? I would just be trying to hoard as many assets as possible to try and have ammunition to go get a quarterback in the offseason. Now, maybe it's we go and get Matthew Stafford and we don't love this quarterback class. We roll it over another year and we want to be in the Arch Manning sweepstakes. There's plenty of ways you could go down it, but the number one priority for them is how do we get enough ammunition to go get a quarterback? And if we're picking 8, 9, maybe that's in the range, but we're probably going to need something to get into the top 3 just with the way the inflation of the quarterback market goes. And so what assets can we get? And Kayvon Thibodeau has really developed nicely, and he looks like he's going to be a good rotational pass rusher for a bunch of teams. But you've got Burns, you've got Lawrence, you could probably bring Ojulari back pretty cheap in the offseason compared to keeping Thibodeau around, having to think about an extension with him. And that 3-man group, to me, it would be plenty fine going into next season if it gives you the chance to go and attack and get the rookie you want in the draft. So I would dangle out as much as possible everyone who's leaving, everyone who's been a bit of a misfire in the first round, as long as it's not Neighbors, Lawrence, Burns. I think pretty much everyone should be on the table.
And Thomas as well, Andrew Thomas. You're not going to move on from Andrew Thomas, but the people understood that was an obvious with him being hurt. Obviously, we weren't talking about it anyways because they're not going to move him.